It's crazy, right? I remember us sitting in a bank and trying to figure out some very early machine learning models for some very basic stuff and how difficult that was. And now to today, it's like night and day within a decade. I don't know if there's probably like a decade in which you could probably look back and see such a dramatic change in a given industry. We were the crazy guys back then. We're not so crazy anymore, I guess.
Kylan Gibbs, CEO and co-founder of Inworld AI. Founded in 2021, the company has raised over $120 million and is now valued at $500 million.
If you want to build an application, if you want to build a business, it's really your intention and your willpower that is kind of the barrier. Now that those skills and knowledge will be augmented by AI, the most important thing is, what is the work ethic? What is the will? What is the intent that they're developing? What is the creative understanding they have of the world?
You mentioned in your TED Talk, you said that if human intelligence can be replicated or even surpassed by AI, what does that mean for our sense of human purpose and meaning?
There was this kind of interesting learning that I personally had going from DeepMind, which was...
Welcome to today's episode. I'm Sumner Makin, a partner at Bain & Company, where I lead the firm's AI work in the UK. And today I'm especially delighted to be joined by Kylan Gibbs, CEO and co-founder of Inworld AI, and indeed one of my former colleagues. Especially thrilled to be chatting to you now. It's just brilliant to have you here, Martin.
Thank you so much, Sumner. It's such a pleasure. I mean, it's fun, right? I mean, I don't even know how long ago that was that we first worked together, but it's crazy, right? I remember us sitting in a bank and trying to figure out some very early machine learning models for some very basic stuff and how difficult that was. And now to today, it's like night and day within a decade. And yeah, it's really bizarre, actually. I don't know if there's probably like a decade in which you could probably look back and see such a dramatic change in a given industry. We were the crazy guys back then. We're not so crazy anymore, I guess.
I'd like to be a little bit crazy, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a huge change from sitting in that bank, really struggling with data which was not what it should have been. What prompted you to come on this journey to found Inworld?
So I studied like political science and neuroscience when I was at university, and I got even interested in like data science and analytics because it seemed like there was a way to use it to create experiences, products, applications, policies that were more tailored to the individual citizen consumer. And so I've always kind of been looking at it from that angle. Early on, of course, it was like largely around like data science, so like targeting, user understanding, basic analytics to understand how to do pricing models, how to develop products more effectively. And then, of course, I just think that the goal is always to maintain the same, but the technology has basically given different affordances. And so I think that the shift became kind of as I stepped into DeepMind, I carried over that kind of goal. And I mean, even at Bain, I think what we were doing was using early data science and analytics to help our customers create better products, better services, better businesses. And when I went to DeepMind, I was lucky enough to kind of just get very early exposure to early generative models. And I started realizing like no longer do we need to use machine learning as a way just to understand the user in the business. We can actually use it to create the business or the product. And that was like, I remember like there was a specific moment where I interacted with one of the earliest LLMs at DeepMind. And I'm not even sure which generation it was. And I had a conversation with it and I was like, holy crap. This is and it was horrible compared to what we have now. But it was like, I mean, it was probably one of the, there was not a lot of people in the world that had had that experience. And so I was wowed, to be honest. And at that time, DeepMind was still fairly underinvested in language and was very focused on reinforcement learning. And so I then kind of got to see what happened as the early GPT-2, GPT-3 era kind of evolved, what that kind of reflected in terms of DeepMind and Google. And then when I was at DeepMind, my role kind of shifted from helping out on the research strategy side to helping out to actually productionize DeepMind models through Google products. And it was very obvious to me that there was going to be strong momentum around business-facing automation use cases. But there was a very kind of strong friction between having generative AI flow into the hands of consumers in any way, shape, or form. And so that was kind of just like, that seemed to me an important problem to solve.
But why did you choose text to speech? It's a very particular area.
So,
I mean, they're a hugely exciting one, but
yeah. So we've worked with dozens of very large gaming media companies, Microsoft, Ubisoft, NVIDIA, Logitech, and there's also tons of, newer AI native consumer apps that we worked with. And when you basically like what our goal is to say, how can we be the best provider of models for consumer facing AI companies? And so we do, we provide, routing solutions in that for LLMs, and we provide other areas as well. And the reality is that we just saw there are LLMs out there that can work for most use
Mm.
cases. There's a large enough market of models that people, if they need to hit a certain quality, a certain cost bar, there is basically a resource there. And it was simply the fact that if people wanted to build a voice enabled experience, it was just way too freaking expensive. So that actually became the first thing that we wanted to solve. Was we said people cannot build real time consumer facing experiences because voice is too expensive.
Mm.
Very simple problem. So we set out to just solve that and say, okay, let's build a low cost text to speech model.
Mm.
The funny part was is we did a really good job of building a low cost model and ended up also beating the benchmarks on the quality side. And I think the lesson there was what the cost focus forced us to do was focus on lower level optimizations, kernel level, like basically like optimizing at that compute level to get that efficiency out of it.
Mm.
But when we went to that deeper level, we were also able to, let's say, upgrade certain parts of the architecture that also enhance quality.
Mm.
And so I think there's something there, which is like constraints are always a good thing when you're building great technology. And also starting kind of with the economic piece, which is the cost piece, forced us to create a model that was efficient, which also means now it's very fast. It's the
Mm.
fastest model on the market as well, because it's simply compute efficient. And so I think what's happening now is, of course, is having this kind of explosion.
Mm.
We're continuing to kind of think about how we power that, also how we connect in voice with other modalities like video, which is becoming very big, how we connect it with images. But the reality is that I think that when you have a consumer facing experience, humans tend to see AI in an anthropomorphic way.
Yeah.
We're having a conversation right now. It's freaking impossible to interact with another human that is not in a conversational format. And if you're having a conversation, it's going to be over voice, it's going to be over text, or it's going to be over video, or it's going to be in
Mm.
person. Now, it basically means that the primary modality of interaction is either going to be text or voice. So we basically solved text. Now we need to solve voice. And I won't say like there's been great text to speech providers on the market, but they just haven't hit that kind of quality and cost bar that's needed for real time experiences. And so that became the focus. And I continue to think that will be the case. That as AI continues to evolve, it will continue to take anthropomorphic human like shapes, and those human like shapes will always require a conversational piece because that's just how we interact with each other, and that's how we're going to expect from AI as well.
And then does that make sense from why choose voice? And why games first? I mean, you could have gone after, say, call centers, or
Yeah.
I mean, games is far more interesting.
Yeah. This is always the interesting question. So, I mean, when we started 4 years ago, we were the really crazy guys.
Yeah.
Like we created this early demo of a talking character in an Oculus headset. This was just after Oculus, the Meta
Yeah.
had acquired Oculus, the first kind of meta version of Oculus came out. And people would have put on this headset and it was very bad graphics, very bad LLMs, very bad voice. But you were talking in real time to a character and getting a response.
Yeah.
And I remember investors, early partners being like, holy crap, this is cool. This was 2 years before ChatGPT, way before any of that. And so the thing was, though, at that point, like businesses were like, there's no way I'm putting this in front of my consumers. And we also knew this from Google, I think is the interesting part. So I had tried for almost 2 years to try and get this in front of, Google's products, and also to see the legal concerns around that, to see the kind of general product concerns, this kind of unfamiliarity that people had at the time with generative models, and the fact that, yes, they are inherently unpredictable, and businesses were scared to death of that. So the reality is games is always an experimental space. It's why there tends to be a lot of great new technologies that are developed in games, because yes, you're developing it for fun. Fun is the outcome.
Yeah.
There's very little kind of consequential real world, like if something catastrophic happens, okay, your game goes down for a day. It's bad, but it's very different than it's a healthcare scenario and you're operating a hospital with robots, right?
Yeah.
It's a very different. And so I think that it was the right group, and I love and we continue to work with a lot of games people because I think they're very creative. They approach technology from that kind of creative lens, and they place a lot of like constraints. Like it needs to be super low cost. There's a lot of focus on like compute efficiency. It needs to be very fast. A lot of it needs to run on a device. So it kind of both gave us the opportunity, but also I think forced us into the type of like technical efficiency and optimization that was needed to build the best quality products.
That's a really good insight. That they're up for it, and willing to try new stuff. And that's quite a discipline in terms of achieving the low cost on device. That's quite a shopping list. So I suppose you'd have cracked the more difficult problems early. Just thinking about your experience at Bain to start with, and then going to DeepMind, and finally where you are now, is there anything from Bain that you actually use every week as a founder and CEO? Was there anything that was useful?
So I'll give you some interesting points.
Yeah,
There's been different parts of the toolkit that I've actually used across time.
cool.
So I'd say actually the first thing that Bain gave me was when I went over to DeepMind, the general presentation quality and this understanding, like really, I mean, and you don't even learn this as an associate consultant at Bain, but really what you're learning is how to sell ideas,
Mm,
right? That's fundamentally what you're doing. And to sell an idea, yes, a good presentation, a good slide deck really helps.
yeah.
Being articulate, starting answer first, right? Starting with the way to kind of lead someone forward. Those basic things give you kind of an understanding of how to present. So that was very helpful, I think, when engaging with executives across DeepMind and Google and kind of being able to show up and, um, you know, being able to show up and being like, oh, I'm going to take this person seriously, even though they're very, they're not a senior person.
Mm,
They're not going to listen to me. I'm not going to listen to them based on their credentials. They've been working here for, 2 months. But they sound pretty legitimate, and what they're saying makes sense, and it's well articulated. So I'm going to basically listen to that. So I think that started out. Now zoom way forward to now. I think that some of the things around that I had to unlearn, I think is
mm.
a bit of the perfectionism. Like I think as a founder, it's
Yeah,
super
that's never going to
chaotic.
happen.
You need, and it's basically, I think, as a founder, especially in the current era, it's like momentum beats perfectionism.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the other things I'd say I had to unlearn a little bit, because I think at a certain point, you're just like, you just need to do more and you don't always know it's going to be successful. And so you just need to have more options. However, the general kind of concept of zero defect also kind of really stayed with me from Bain,
Mm,
which is like, of course, this kind of like crazy ideal that you never can actually
no.
achieve. Like, yeah, of course, it's never going to be zero defect. We all know. No, you're looking back, you know that now. As week one associate consultant, you're like, oh my god, zero defect. How am I possibly going to do this? But but when you come into it as a founder CEO, you start to be like, okay, that's a good goal, And when my team sends out emails to a customer, and I can go in and say, hey, you had a spelling mistake in there. What's that going to kind of cause for the customer's perception of you? You created this
Yeah.
presentation, and that basically wrongly describes what the customer's product is. That's a big deal. That's going to reduce trust. When we have a product launch and all of a sudden people are clicking on a link and there's a 404 error, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So it's those little things as well, which is just like that kind of recognition that what you're gonna do, you're gonna do well, right?
Mm,
And if that means you're gonna,
mm.
if that means you're gonna stay up till 12 a.m. midnight to make it zero defect, that's probably worthwhile, because otherwise you're reducing the kind of trust of the customer. So I think what that caused for me is this recognition that, like, yeah, if you're gonna have to put in the extra work to make it good, you should do it. And also that, frankly, one of the things that it naturally, I think, why I still believe a lot of people should start with consulting or investment banking is simply the work ethic.
Mm,
Like, yeah, I was in the office until 12 a.m., 1 a.m., not every day, of course, but like sometimes. And that's a good thing, because it lets you know that that's sometimes necessary. And I find that people who didn't have that experience, sometimes they're like, yeah, I'm going to do the best work I can, but only if I finish by 6 p.m. It's just not, I'm sorry, it's just, you can't be competitive in that world.
yeah.
And so I think that kind of concept of like, you're going to reach for the highest quality bar and you're going to put in the work that's
Mm.
necessary to achieve that, I think is like the best possible thing that anybody can learn early on.
Wow, that's quite a discipline. Then I'm especially curious about the deep mind side of things, because I know a bit about Bain, but one of the things you just talked about was that there was this debate about reinforcement learning versus language models. I think how that debate happened, and what did you learn from DeepMind? We could spend an entire podcast just learning about that, but
Yeah.
I'd love to get into a bit of a
It's,
color
I,
about the
so,
place.
yeah. And I mean, I've actually been reflecting on this a little more and, looking historically. I think that one thing kind of at a meta level that I learned from DeepMind is, I think that at that time, they didn't have any commercial constraints.
Mm,
And I also think they didn't feel any time constraints. There was this belief that AI was going to take a long time.
mm,
There was going to be very little competition, and that we would just be able to continuously do R&D without any commercial requirements. And eventually that would create something like AGI. And so what I think that meant is that the research methods, the approaches were very, very experimental, very long term in nature.
mm,
And that also, of course, allowed them to, like, they were produced huge amounts of papers. They still do, as an incredible research org. But what I think happened when GPT-3 came out was it proved, crap, there's something that's actually a lot easier to make that makes a lot more money. And we live in a capitalist world. Therefore, that thing is going to start drawing in more investment. It's going to start drawing in more customers. It's going to start drawing in more mind share from the industry. And so I think it kind of caused this flip to realize, crap, even if we could do reinforcement learning for the next 10, 15 years and produce something amazing, there's something that has more near-term ROI, and that will naturally end up drawing in more investment. And as we know, just from a basic story, the thing that draws in more investment will end up progressing much faster.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened. It's not to say that like LLMs or generative models are the optimal option, but they are the optimal option under the constraint that we have a commercial and a time barrier.
You talked about it being a very, very sort of research environment. I mean, what was it like to work with Demis?
So yeah, I was in, obviously I didn't work directly with Demis, every day, but I did get to overlap, and I got to work with Karai quite closely, who's now the, he has multiple roles, but one of the CTO of DeepMind in that. And, Demis, the one thing that I think was really interesting about Demis, even early on, and I remember him coming in to give me a presentation when we first joined, is he was and is always painting a vision of the future, but from a very scientific lens. And he always kind of came in as the scientist. And I think that's a very important role to play, especially even in the industry, but an ecosystem now where you have a lot of founders who are not scientists, who are basically selling first and start with the marketing message rather than kind of what the scientific recognition is. And I think that meant, he was always respected from everyone in the company. And I remember just like even being in the first call, and I was like, yeah, this is really exciting. And this guy knows what he's talking about. When you start, I think, with the scientific story, you think a lot more long term. So that's what I always recognize. Like Demis was always thinking very, very long term, like, far beyond his tenure. And there was other things, there was I just remember funny quotes. I don't even know where I heard these at random points, but I remember, Demis had certain opinions, certainly too. Like, he did strongly believe, because I think he had that scientific lens, that long-term lens in things like reinforcement learning. And the fact that, for example, things like language and robotics weren't necessarily as important, because if we built the fundamental technology, they would eventually end up empowering the kind of things like language and robotics and things that were down the line, which actually I think has kind of turned out to be true, at least in the robotics part. But I do think that there was I'm sure, and I mean, now he's leading a very much more commercial focused org, and he's a very adaptable person, so I think he's been able to shift to that. But at that time, at least when I was working with him, he certainly was like the scientist. And I think he still is a scientist. I think he's just a little more commercially minded now. And I think the big thing I took away from kind of working with him, though, is he was always kind and kind of respectful to everyone in the company. He knew every single person in the company's name. When I was there, I think it was around under 1,000 people. I've having encounters, with people like Demis and Jensen and that, you start to pick up on these little leadership things, right? It's very subtle pieces that kind of allow them to excel. And I think one of the ones with Demis is like everyone always respected him, even if I'm sure he disagreed with people in places and probably, disagreed with certain people at Google when he's trying to get funding in that. But like people always respected him. And I think that's because he was the scientist. He's trying to build AGI. Yeah. That's his whole mission in life. And he made that very clear. And so I definitely learned some from that a little bit, of like, and now, what your management style as a CEO differs from person to person, and you can't necessarily copy someone else's, but you can certainly learn, I think, what works for them.
So that you've been able to learn from how he approached being a CEO and applied that to your own leadership. One of the things is you left the world's premier AI lab just before everything went mad.
Yeah.
But then also started a business worth half a unicorn. What led you to make that decision?
I mean, I even when we were working together, like I always had these entrepreneurial ambitions, but I also kind of recognized that. I mean, it's funny now because I spent living in Silicon Valley. I see like Stanford students who exit their undergrad, and of course, the first thing they're going to do is go and try and raise a seed round. And I feel like Stanford, has basically trained their undergrads to believe that the best thing they can possibly do upon graduating is raise a seed round. I recognized that I needed, some learning. I needed to kind of, get the skills I think I got from consulting, the technical understanding I got from DeepMind. So I always kind of set out with that ambition. And then I think at a certain point, it was just like the pace, even with the pace and the leverage that you have. I recognized in myself that like, I'm not going to ever change the amount or the degree of my work. I'm going to always work super hard. I'm always going to do my best. I'm always going to try and, develop my technical and business understanding. I would have the highest leverage, not just even for myself, but for the economy, for customers, if I was operating my own product, if I was operating my own
Mm.
business. And so I remember I was actually at the end of my, I was kind of starting to recognize this towards the end of DeepMind. I was like, okay, I need to basically do something where I'm going to have more say in this, and also where the opinions that I had, like at that time, I was trying to basically say to, DeepMind and Google, like, let's take LLMs and turn them into a
Yeah.
product. And there was so much resistance to that. And that took another 4 or 5 years to actually
Yeah.
productionize. And so I think that that kind of ability just to act on the intuition and the recognitions that you have, and to be able to apply your own workforce, like your own, work energy behind that, and to see the results as a person who is very results oriented, is very customer oriented, is very satisfying. Because the challenge is also, like, at a company like DeepMind or Google, you may see, for example, a customer problem, and to mobilize the resources to solve it takes months.
Yeah.
Now, you're going to probably solve it at scale for many customers, but there's this kind of, like, when you're trying to be empathetic and understand a customer pain point and you're trying to solve it, it becomes quite frustrating after a long time when it's like, okay, I can solve it. But to do that, I'm going to spend a year in VP reviews, developing slide decks to convince this person to hire 2 people, and so on and so forth. And instead, I can go and raise, $20 million and set out and try and do it myself. Now I'm going to have way less resources and way less, capacity than Google will have. But if I do the right things, I will be able to have much more leverage. And overall in the economy, I think that's the best way I can contribute.
Well, just amazing timing to be setting things up before everyone else had even woken up. Uh, Indeed, I sometimes think that not everyone else has woken up yet, even now.
No, I certainly, it's, I mean, the reality is that's one of the things that I like to focus on. Like, if you talk to most people in the world today and said, how is AI changing your lives? 99% of people are going to say, well, I see cool videos on Instagram that are generated with, like, cats riding elephants. Okay. Is that the real impact that we have? So I think I still maintain the ambition that, like, AI has this incredible capacity to change the lives of everyday consumers, and we're so far from it still, so far from it, and so the work kind of remains.
Completely. One thing I've noticed with talking to both founders and VCs is that many AI businesses really struggle with their moat because things are moving just stupidly quickly. Where does Inworld offer something that really is massively distinctive and in a sustained way? I mean, you mentioned earlier that it's both low cost and the highest quality, which is a pretty good
Yeah.
combo. How do you deal with that issue that so many people are wrestling with at the moment?
So I think that when people start with differentiation or a moat, um, they often start with the technical side, or especially as technical founders, often, who are the most common, I think, type
Yeah.
today. You often say, okay, what does their product have that my product doesn't have, right? Or what does my product have that their product doesn't have? I think that instead it's better to say, okay, who am I serving and how am I serving them better than anyone else? And so
Mm.
for us, looking at these consumer facing companies, right? When you think about AI overall, there's of course incredible models, incredible capacities, and there's how many companies that are solving different business problems with it. But when you look at a consumer company, okay, let's think about the different stages. Okay, so first of all, a lot of them are bringing in their customers through paid ads.
Mm.
That's very different from a business, right? So you're bringing in customers from paid ads, or you're doing some organic, influencer marketing or something along those
Yeah.
lines. How are you using the information of who your customers are, which funnels they're coming from, to inform what best models to serve them, for
Mm.
example, right? So if I'm growing a consumer business and I'm getting a lot of growth in Russia and Brazil, I know that those customers probably aren't going to open up their wallets. So I better find another way to monetize them, which means maybe I'm going to give them cheaper models, and I'm also going to give them an ad supported version of the application.
Mm.
If I'm giving my customers, it's a apparently a wealthy person in Western Europe, I'm going to maybe give them higher models, and I'm going to try to push them to subscription. And then basically, as I start to work with my customers, I'm going to understand, how am I developing an understanding of who my users are, what is the best kind of quality of experience I can give them. If you're talking to ChatGPT about a pricing
Yeah.
scenario, you just want to write, you want the right answer.
Yeah.
You don't care how it says it. You don't care what voice it says it in. You don't care all those things. But when you're trying to have an entertaining experience and you're talking to a companion, you really care about the way that it speaks. You really care about the voice.
Mm.
And so we've also developed ways of understanding, how do we personalize models to the customer? How do we develop an understanding of the customer that allows us to select the right models, or even fine tune models, or run reinforcement learning to tailor it specifically to the experience of that customer? Now you've got hundreds of LLMs, hundreds of different voices, hundreds of text to speech providers. All I see as my job is to help my customers select the right ones at the right moment in
Mm.
real time, even automatically, that maximize the business metrics to matter to them. Like, I'll just give you an example is like, we've found that just changing the voice, for example, in a specific experience can plus or minus retention by like 50%.
Wow,
Huge jumps,
that's
right? And
crazy.
so those little pieces really add up, changing between different models. Like a lot of customers start by saying, I'm going to give 100% of my customers GPT 5.2. Okay, you could do
Wow.
that, but are you optimizing that? Maybe if you segment your customers and you start realizing that, women in France under 25 have a preference for a different type of interaction than men in Texas over 50. For sure. That makes sense
Yeah.
intuitively. We all know that from a consumer perspective, but often everybody is serving these uniform AI experiences and not recognizing that there requires a variation on that. So I know that's a long-winded way to kind of say that, what I'm really trying to do is deeply understand what are the challenges that are blocking the inception and scale of consumer facing AI experiences, and how can I be the best possible model provider for them? And so routing is actually a big focus of ours now too, and we're going to be having a new product coming up around that too, because I've started to realize like that is at the core of it, is just basically in any different context, how am I selecting the right model for the job? Quite simple.
Wow. I think that's a good learning for all founders, that maybe it isn't the technical moat, it's everything that comes together and actually serves the customer.
Yeah. And to make that as simple as possible. You want basically the smallest product surface that solves the largest pain for the customer. And that's, I think, one of the things that I learned over time too, is we've built, at different times, very complex products and services and experiences. And what I've realized is, your job is to try and have this kind of weird iceberg where you have the smallest piece on the top the customer's actually interacting with, and that they get the most out of that. Whereas I think what a lot of people do is they, build this weird block where the customer's got to interact with so many different parts of the product surface to get the value. And the reality is people don't have the time and attention for that anymore. You got to make it dead simple.
Who would think the secret to a moat is simplicity? Question a lot of people ask is, like, you're an AI company. How do you use AI? What does an AI native business really look like?
Oh man. So I'll just give you like even my personal
Yeah.
workflows. The biggest shift in my personal workflow that I had in the last year. So I use granola or like one of these notes apps for everything. And then what I do is I take my granola notes. We use Linear, for example, for our internal organization of engineering projects. We use HubSpot, for example, for like marketing and sales.
Mm.
And then we use a bunch of AI tools like Clay, for example, for sales. And we have a ton of other marketing automations. So what I do is I basically have MCPs to Claude set up for every single one of the surfaces.
Yeah.
So I literally have my entire granola notes base and my entire context of all my conversations. I've got my personal notes, of course, that I take on the side.
Mm.
And I've got the entire data from the company that I push into MCPs and into Claude. And so then I can go to Claude and say, tell me the current state of the business. And it will basically pull for all of that and
Wow.
tell me, or I can ask a question like, okay, in the last week, or I'll get a product question like, okay, I'm trying to understand, you know, what are the major pain points that people are currently having with other text to speech providers in a given use
Yeah.
case? And I'll be able to pull all that context. I'll also be able to understand, okay, how does that currently map to our current engineering roadmap? Okay, great. It's going to pull in the linear. So what I'm trying to do is basically amass as much information. I'm very good at interacting, with the different chat interfaces and that, and kind of interact with it. So that basically means that I now have the capacity to gain all of the information I need at any given moment about the business to make a decision. Other basic things like I also am able to produce, like as a CEO, I'm sure like 20 years ago, it would be freaking hard to produce your own documents. You're doing your own IC
Yeah.
work. Sometimes now I'm like, okay, like yesterday I had a conversation with one of our engineering leads on an evaluation
Mm.
product, and 30 minutes after the conversation, I produced a PRD, like product requirements doc.
Yeah.
I did. And I produced a product mock, a working product mock that was interactable in 30 minutes, all of this, and shipped it back to the team and said, okay, let's build this by the end of next week. So
That's
like that
velocity.
ability to go from that concept to that. So I used, Claude Code for the mock. I used, I think, a mix of ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude to create the PRD. And I of course go through and edit and everything else now. But at this point, like I'm good enough at working with it that I can produce those docs. So it means like I also now become like 5 ICs on the side of our company,
Yeah.
and that also gives some benefit. In terms of the organization, like our team uses, of course, like tons of different AI generated code. Everybody in our company is using Cursor or Cloud Code or one of the variants. One of our engineering leads built like a brand new end to end product over the Christmas break. So it's like literally what probably could have taken 7 months of 10 people's time before, and he just did it in a week. Those, of course, things. On the sales and marketing
Mm.
side is some of the most interesting. So what we've been finding is that like AI native sales is really like I think a very important moat. Like how are you massively scaling your sales operation? And that could be how you're just developing messages of outreach. How are you understanding from customer calls the different pain points? How are you developing decks? So we use a ton of different tools on that side. Marketing creative. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I think that still remains, interestingly, even though the tools have gotten better, is like when you're doing ads, for example, how are you creating all the different creative for that?
Mm.
Like it used to be that we had a designer who was like just every time that we needed to produce something was in massive pain. And now we have, marketing folks who are able to create the content for that. So it's like every part of the business is basically touched by this. And we continue to kind of strive to do this. I know there are other companies that are doing this even better, and I want to continue to build more automation around that. But the goal is effectively that like, and I think there used to be kind of this, my thinking on it is not like how do I just automate processes, but how can I enable each member of my team with the right tools so that they themselves become 5x more effective, 10x more effective. And that's challenging in a lot of cases, right? But I do think like even our recruiting, we use AI for our
Yeah.
recruiting. Like literally in every part of the business, there's something that we do. And I won't say it's always like seamless and it always works out of the box, but certainly it does have a net impact over time that as you're just trying to test these things and different functions are learning how to be familiar with them, it just completely catalyzes much faster movement.
That's incredible. You found that things like Claude Code and Cursor are very good for writing production code?
Good question. So there's this funny, I mean, you've probably seen some of the reports that are coming out in that, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a ton of usage of it. How much of that code is ending up at high scale, large production apps is actually not that high. So like people are using it to build a lot of prototypes, demos. We've found that it's very good for certain things today still, like front end code, for
Yeah.
example. It remains very hard for kind of back end systems, databases, and that kind of stuff. So I'd say there's certain areas where you waste a lot of time. And like you could talk to an engineer and they recognize this. Like Cursor, Cloud Code are almost too fun. So people will spend like 4 hours on them when
Yeah.
like the task should take an hour because they're just prompting it. So I think honestly, we probably went through a period last year where I would say the net impact of AI generated code or code platforms was pretty neutral or even negative. Now I think we're starting to understand, and it's part of it is just the tools are getting better.
Mm.
Another part of it is just understanding where to use it and when not to use it. And so I think at our point, like because a lot of the systems that we work on are very low level, like the modeling work that we
Mm.
do, the kernel level optimizations, it's not that helpful for that. It is very helpful, I think, when the team or engineers are able to get the information they need to make a decision at a given time and they can just use it for almost a search
Yeah.
function. But I think it will continue to get better. There's no doubt in my mind. But I definitely think teams need to have more discipline around it because I've seen especially among our customers in that, and maybe who are more less technical teams, they get very used to using vibe coding, and then something breaks in production, and they don't even know. Like
Yeah.
literally, like you could have a CTO who's like, "I have no idea what broke, and I don't know what's going on inside my system."
Yeah.
I heard a funny stat from. Now I can't validate this, and it's not my own first party information, but someone was telling me that they were advising kind of one of the earliest, the most recent Y Combinator batches, and they said that I forget what it was, like 30% to 40, 50% of the CTOs in the Y Combinator batch like weren't familiar with what a file system was or how to interact with a file system. I think it was maybe more like 25, 30%. And so
Wow.
the reason for that was that a lot of them had vibe coded their application. So if you ask them to say, okay, like can you just explain to me in very basic
Mm.
computer science or software engineering terms how you built this? There was not knowledge.
Oh dear.
Now that might not become a problem. Maybe we just don't need that in the future for certain types of applications, but it does give me a little bit concern that at some point the best products win. And to me, at
Mm.
some point, the best products need to do something different. Because if everybody's generating the same code, where like back to our question, like where's the moat?
It's kind of scary. Will we AGI our way out of it or possibly sink in a AI code slop? You mentioned in your TED talk something slightly different, sort of what makes us human in the age of AI. You said that if human intelligence can be replicated or even surpassed by AI, what does that mean for our sense of human purpose and meaning? I know that's quite a different conversation, but I do want to
Yeah.
think about things a little bit more deeply as well.
Yeah, I think there is so I mean there was I think this earlier narrative around it, which was like, as we basically didn't need to work,
Mm.
that we would go back to like more human pursuits like creativity and that. And the honest reality is like I think if you really wanted to be a painter,
Mm.
you have the capacity to be a painter. I don't think everybody should become a painter
Yeah,
because all of a sudden they don't need to do their work. I just don't believe that's true.
certainly not.
What I do think it opens up though is okay, there's a very funny, I'm going to give you a funny answer. But I was recently reading a sci-fi book by Samuel Delany, and in it, he kind of talks about how like stupidity is this feeling of the difference between what you're taking in and what you can do with that, basically what your output
Mm,
is. So it's this sense of like personal inefficiency that causes people to feel stupid, and causes people to feel ineffective. And what I hope is the effect of AI is that it gives people the recognition that what they believe needs to exist in the world, they have the capacity to do it.
mm,
And that it causes people to have a greater sense of agency. And that what I think it really returns to the person is that what really matters about you as a person is your intent
mm,
and your vision for like the world, and that everybody has that, and a lot of people have basically discarded it because they thought they couldn't do anything with it. They thought, I'm too stupid, or I don't have the skills, or I don't have this or that. And I think that one of the biggest things that humans are is we're creative, and I don't mean creative in the sense of an artist all the time, but I mean creative in the sense that we bring things into the world. And I think that most of humanity has basically learned that they don't have the agency over that, and that as we start to kind of see AI bring agency to people in different ways, shapes, or
mm,
forms, they will start to recognize that I actually have something that matters to the world, and that's my thoughts, that's my opinions, that's my intentions for what I want to create. And I hope that basically helps people kind of recognize that like what it means to be a human
mm.
is to be a thing that has a purposeful intent for how the world should look.
Yeah.
And I think that's very different for how a lot of like animals, and I'm not saying, there's lots of smart animals in that, but I don't think they have
No.
an intention to shape the world alongside with what they think is good for it. And I think that's ultimately what we are, is we are generative beings, and we just happen to create this thing that is a generative technology to support that. And so I think that, I have no idea what it looks for the next 100, 200 years, but I hope that one of the things is that people start to realize that they have agency in this.
Mm.
There's of course there's a very dark, turn that it could take, but that's my hope. That's my optimistic take on what it will look like.
You talked about things 100 years ago, uh, and I'm thinking sort of more immediately. I've got an 8-month-old son.
Yeah.
What do you think life's going to be like for him or someone of his age?
So I have one funny thing, which is, how there's this kind of meme about iPad kids. I think that there will be a meme about like ChatGPT kids in like 20 years. And I think there will be, in the same way that early social media, I think people didn't properly learn how to manage, and therefore it has consequences for cyberbullying and all those kinds of things. I think there will
Mm,
be issues with that. So I say that's one caution, right? Is make sure that you're kind of thoughtful about the fact that we probably won't figure out all the safety in that before AI actually gets into the hands of kids. On the other hand, though, I think like it's a great time to be a creator, and when I'm a creator
yeah.
builder, right, to
Yeah.
do something. And I think that, like I said before, I think that regardless of, how kids grow up now, I think they could
Mm,
really do whatever they wanted if they set their mind to it, right? If you want to build an application, if you want to build a business, if you want to be a financial analyst, you now have like it's really your intention and your willpower that is kind of the barrier behind
yeah.
all of this. And especially I think, by the time your baby is grown and working, I think that will be very true. And so I think that the biggest thing is for kids is just like how do we develop their sense of purpose, their sense of intent. I think that we were very, very focused in the 20th century on how do we develop skills and knowledge. And I think now that those skills and knowledge will be largely handled or at least augmented by AI, the most important thing is what is the work ethic? What is the will? What is the intent that they're developing? What is the creative understanding that they have of the world? And so I hope, that your that your family basically is able to kind of take that on, because I think it's such an amazing opportunity.
That's a very exciting one. It's just a world where you don't even need to be a painter to create beautiful paintings, but you do need to have that eye. It's a crazy place. Well, thank you very much for chatting. Where can people find you? Where can our listeners learn more?
Yeah. I mean, just you can check out our website, Inworld.ai,
Mm,
try out our text to speech, try out our router, that will all be available. Also, if you want to reach out to us at any time, we've got forums on there. Reach out, join our LinkedIn, our Twitter. You can follow it there. If you want to reach out to me personally, you can reach out on LinkedIn. I'll do my best to get back. I'm always kind of supportive, especially for people who are thinking about what it takes to build consumer facing AI and for businesses who are trying to doing it. I'm always available. I'm kind of keen to do whatever I can to catalyze this kind of next wave of applications. So yeah, reach out wherever you can.
Brilliant. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Summer. It's always a pleasure to talk. I love what you're doing. I love the energy. So I really appreciate it and grateful for this.